Well, we already have our Christmas episode in the bag. Um,
Yeah.
and I won't give it away, I guess, just yet. But I wanted to dress up for Christmas for this episode because I
See,
don't do this for our actual Christmas episode. So
no, you were. It was
I do.
just
Oh,
thematic for
I
Christmas
know, but
Carol.
it's not. Oh, well, you just gave it away.
What?
You suck.
Oh, it was supposed to be a surprise? I mean, you
Well,
can
I don't
cut this
know.
out. Is this
Yeah,
really the such good banter that you're gonna need to leave it in? I
I don't know.
mean,
Maybe it is now.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
self-referential banter. That's. I mean, who's
I've
thought
come
of that
to.
before?
I think that
Who's thought
all
of
of our
that on a
banter
podcast before?
is basically just us, being unprofessional.
Complaining about each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
To that
Uh,
end, I think you've got some episodes that you need to edit in the hopper. Did
yeah,
you see
it's
my?
true.
Yeah.
Oh no, I don't know. Did you send me a text? I haven't seen
I.
the latest text.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's just the it'll be this episode, which I have to do technically first, and
Yeah.
then the episode.
Warriors, Poe, and
Oh,
Telos.
it
And
these are
Telos.
yeah, these are edited, but they're not posted. And
Yeah.
there's yeah. So okay, you had me worried there for a sec. I was like, am I like really far behind on these? I'm not
No,
so
it's
like they're just not posted.
I don't
Um,
want you to fall into that post-Christmas stupor that I know you are want to do.
oh yeah,
And
is
yeah,
this so?
to leave the good people hanging is what I
Uh-huh,
am concerned with. So you
sure.
finally got around to watching Loki season 2, Jacob, is what
Yes,
we're
we
gonna.
basically we it's funny, I re-listened to Loki season 1 episode just to, like, remember what we were talking about for that one,
That's good
and
because we're
not
gonna do a recap. So yeah,
yeah, well, not only do we talk about how we don't wait too long to, like, post these episodes before posting them, which in
yeah,
Loki's case, we waited forever to actually post that episode after we
yeah.
recorded it. It's not even video. It's still,
Oh,
just like a
really?
title card, yeah. And then there was something else too. Basically, we break everything we say we don't do in that episode by posting it as late as we did. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, oh well. But hey, I did joke about it being like a two-part episode, and now it's basically gonna be a two-part episode
I was
because
gonna say,
here
like,
we
yeah,
are.
I was thinking in my head, I was thinking like, oh, should we release season 2 in the same week as like a bonus or something? But that's
Mhm.
cut that out. We're not gonna use that. So let's I mean, now that we've jumped right in. So
Yep.
you just
Loki
listened to
season
Loki
2.
season 1. Well, it's Loki season 2.
Mhm,
Title, clever title to be named later, and
mhm.
because I don't know if we really have a title for this either, but
I think it might just be "What?" Question
I
mark.
mean, and it was supposed to be sort of a wrap up of the character. I think everybody's kind of been talking about that, or have pretty much concluded that Tom Hiddleston's Loki is effectively done, at least for now. Like, or okay,
Mhm.
for now, like done with no plan in the near future. Like, I know
This is
everybody always
his
talks about, or the clickbaity article is always, is so and so going to come back? You still see those with like Robert Downey Jr. It's like, no, like that, it's the story is over, let it go.
yeah. Right,
And
right.
that's kind of what we see with Loki's, or sorry, Tom Hiddleston's Loki, is
Yep.
his story, in a sense, both of his strands, right? His first strand where he dies in Avengers Infinity War, and now this strand, are it's all tied up, it's all wrapped up in a bow. So
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that this is just fine, right? Like, in other words, if they never do another thing with Loki, Tom Hiddleston's Loki ever again, like, I will be satisfied. And I love that
mhm,
character. I'm not saying that I look forward to him no longer being in projects, but this was a good conclusion for him. It's a
mhm.
fascinating story they tell. A surprising story. Didn't really see it coming. Like neither of these two things. Like when I heard they were making a Loki TV show, I did not anticipate the Loki TV show they made. I'll say that
Yeah.
much. It's completely out of left field for the character, but it makes for a fun fish out of water type situation. I would say that the Loki TV show is almost definitely my favorite Marvel TV show out of any of the
Mhm.
ones I've watched. I at this point, the only one I haven't seen is actually Secret Invasion, which
You
I didn't hear
you watched
great
the
things
Hawkeye
about.
one and, Falcon and the
Oh,
Winter Soldier?
I did watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I only saw the first, like, 2 episodes of Hawkeye, and
Okay.
so I
That's
take
a
it back.
Christmas themed one. You could watch that one and
I maybe I should. Maybe I'll check
yeah,
that one off the little, bucket
your
Christmas list.
Marvel bingo card, yeah.
Yeah, I might as well. I've gotten this far into the Marvel universe that I might as
It's
well be a completionist, and that's kind of what's driving me. But
okay.
the Loki series is really interesting. It's really interesting. I love the aesthetic of it. I love the questions that it asks. Um, I think season one had more of an impact because it
Mm.
was new and fresh, and a lot of the novelty of it goes a long way. And season two has a very different vibe from
Was
season one.
season 1 the first Marvel TV show, or was it, Vision and the WandaVision one? I thought it was WandaVision. Was the first
WandaVision
one
did come out first, yeah.
okay.
Um, are we missing one? I don't know. As like some of those the earlier TV shows is what I mean by that. But yeah, maybe it was just WandaVision. Maybe that was the very first Marvel TV show, unlike Disney Plus, right? And we're not
Yeah.
talking about like the Netflix, they're kind of like ambivalent.
The
I'm
the,
not
like,
sure.
Defenders, yeah, the, like,
Yeah, all that
Daredevil,
stuff.
Jessica Jones, all that, yeah.
Mhm.
Which I
Yep.
did watch, I watched the first 2 seasons of the Netflix Daredevil,
Mhm.
and maybe just the first season, I can't remember, but yeah, it's been one of those where it's like pretty much everything after Endgame, I am much less invested, and so it took me a long time to watch WandaVision. I think it took me a little while to watch Loki as well. It was more like if
Yeah.
somebody that I wanted to talk about it with was like talking about it, then it's like, oh well, maybe I'll do it for the sake of us having a fun
No,
conversation or
this
something.
podcast keeps me way more accountable for like keeping up on like current pop
Yeah,
culture like stuff
yeah.
than I ever
See,
would be
and
otherwise.
it wasn't even you actually, because I was gonna like usually it'll be like, oh, somebody was talking about it, and this is before, this is like I don't. It was kind of like before we even started hanging out that much. I think, um, because WandaVision that was like right after Endgame or not long, maybe a year
Yeah,
after
I suppose
Endgame.
you're right. That was kind of like the
So,
introductory thing, huh? That's a wild
but
series. We've never actually had a
yeah.
conversation about that one, but we should at
No,
some
and
point.
actually, it'd be a really good one because they have the whole, and I mean they're very on the nose about it, but like the Theseus is the ship of Theseus. I mean,
Mhm.
like where it's like you replace all the parts and identity, and I mean it would be a worthwhile, and it's a perennial philosophical topic, so it's one that we could definitely touch on too, and just kind of refer back to. Uh,
I'd
you
be
know,
there for it. It's a strange show, but, whatever. We'll talk about that in a episode about that, I suppose,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um,
So they do have to do quite a bit of recap just because season 2 came out what 2.5 years after season 1 or so. So
and
they
it
recap
wasn't
a lot
that
of
easy to
season
follow to
1.
begin with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Both
Yeah.
I think both seasons, especially I mean, maybe season 2 even more so. Um, it's way easier to just, like, follow along with it and be like, "Uh-huh, uh-huh,
Mhm.
uh-huh," than it is to, like, sit back and be like, "Wait a second. A
Yeah.
plus B equals C minus D." Like, this show is I feel like is playing kinda fast and loose with, like, its own internal universe rules, and I think it
Yeah.
doesn't care. I think that it's like
Well,
if we get too bogged down in the details of this
here's
place is
your here's your
yeah.
like here's your I don't know if you want to say uh referential like title for it's like a cross between Groundhog Day and Butterfly Effect, where it's like you've got the Groundhog Day thing of he's like reliving, so much
Mm,
of this timeline over and over again, but it's also Butterfly Effect because he's trying out all these different ways that will like make it quote unquote work, right? If we think
yeah.
of, and I know we haven't talked about the kind of big like conflict or the big kind of problem that needs to be solved, but it's so much of our Tom Hiddleston Loki having to kind of keep going back and either tweaking something or adjusting something or going back, 5 minutes earlier in each time, like
There's an
5 minutes
awful
earlier,
lot
5
of
minutes
that in
earlier.
season
And
2. Yeah.
I mean, they do quite like flat out say like he does it like 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or something like it's
Well, I
just
mean,
it's
there is a centuries,
yeah,
like, title card. It's like centuries
yeah,
later because he's
yeah.
been trying to fix something for centuries.
Well, and I think the joke is like, "How long would this take?" And he goes, "Centuries," and then it cuts
Yeah.
to
Well, yeah,
centuries,
alright. So, I mean, we
like a
don't have to be coy
SpongeBob
about it. He needs to
like a SpongeBob
eventually, in
thing.
order to figure out, I mean, should we just get into the actual, like, plot of season 2? Um,
Yeah. Well, actually, but really quick, end of season 1, he and the other Loki, variant go back to the beginning of time. Which is where they meet the kind of Jonathan Majors, Kang, He Who
mhm.
Remains, and he comes up later in Ant-Man and the Wasp as like, the big bad guy. He
He's
was
the
supposed to
King
be
the
the big
Conqueror
bad guy.
character, yeah.
Yeah,
And we talked about this,
and
last week's episode,
but
the one that we
but he's
recorded,
the
like, months
one.
ago.
Since we are going to talk about fate and free will, which was a big theme in season 1, he's kind of the puppet master pulling the strings on
Mhm.
all these different strands of time and the whole TVA. And so the Loki variant, which I don't know what the actress's name is, but she kills him. And that's like the big like, that's end of season 1. And so then going into season 2, well, there's other Kangs, right? That's kind of what we're sort of faced with, is it
Well,
causes this
okay.
big problem with all these ripple effects, and
No,
so they
yeah,
need to
that's the
find this.
well, okay. I'm gonna do a recap. Thank
Okay,
you for your
you do a
recap, Mike.
recap.
Alright, now I'm gonna do a recap. All right. So basically in season 1 is all about fate versus free will. And Loki is introduced to this concept that everything he's done in his entire life has been only allowed. And that if he ever tried to do anything that wasn't according to the dictates of this TVA agency, then
Mhm,
he gets that version of reality gets wiped out. And only one version of reality, the sacred timeline, is allowed to exist, right? Meanwhile, there's another version of him who has escaped from the you know being purged, being pruned is the language that they use,
mhm,
and so she's out trying to stop the TVA and give people free will because basically the idea is that you can't have free will if the choices you make are only allowed to correspond with a pre-approved plan, right?
mhm,
These are fascinating philosophical questions for a Christian, and I hope to get into it this episode. And then by the end of it, they find the main bad guy, this He Who Remains, this Kang the Conqueror variants from other movies, who is at the end of time. He's the one deciding what the sacred timeline is. The sacred timeline is meant to serve so that only he's the only variant that comes into existence. And but Sylvie had her entire life, the Loki variant, the female Loki variant, her entire
mhm.
life was like stolen from her, in order to serve the sacred timeline, and she's like upset
'Cause she
about
was
it.
gonna be pruned or something, right? That was
She
the
was, yeah, she was pruned and then she escaped, as a
mhm,
child, no less. So her entire life has just been on the run from TVA agents, and she wants vengeance and she wants justice. And her definition of justice is free will. Like you can't just remove free will from people to serve this sacred timeline. The hiccup is that he who remains is like if this timeline, if other timelines are allowed to exist beyond this one, then no timelines, all timelines get wiped out. So his
mhm,
catch 22 is that, like, listen, this is here because it has to be. It's either this or it's nothing. Make your choice, right?
yeah,
Um, and so she does. Loki's like, "Hey, wait a second. If he's telling the truth, then we're gonna wipe out all of reality if we kill this guy." And she's like, "I don't trust him. He's a liar anyway, and frankly, I don't care." And so she kills him. And that's how season 1 ends, and season 2 picks up immediate aftermath of that. And the rest of season 2 is gonna be dealing with the fallout of the sacred timeline fracturing into multiple timelines. And it turns out that he who remains was telling the truth.
mhm,
That if the sacred timeline is not kept, then all the other timelines start to fall apart. Which I'm not gonna lie, I don't quite understand this. I don't really understand what's going on. Like, in season 1, the implication seemed to be that what would happen is that all of his other versions, all of his other villainous versions would basically create a war that destroys every reality, right? And that's what we're trying to stop. In season 2, it seems to be the case that
Seems more ad hoc, whereas
the act like, the universes seem to be destroying themselves, like, the timeline.
well
See, I got a little confused,
well,
I'm not gonna lie, I
so,
need to, like,
okay,
rewatch this,
now
like, once before we did this
so
episode.
you're gonna like my
Yeah,
comparison, Jacob. It kinda reminds
okay,
me of, you know how oftentimes, and you'll see this used a lot in, like, monster movies of some kind, or, but it's sort of just like how, if it's all based off this primary, like, origin point, so it's kinda like with the White Walkers in Game of Thrones, where if you were turned by someone, like, bigger than you, so to speak, then if you kill the bigger one, then the smaller pieces, the dominoes all kinda fall. Right? So
okay,
then
sure, alright,
when you kill, like, the general, quote, unquote, "general," like White Walker, then all the ones that that one turned into, like, the, zombie soldiers, they all die
yeah,
too at the same time.
right
So in the
I'm
same way,
tracking on that.
if every timeline strands off of the sacred one, then if you get rid of the sacred one, then the other ones would wither and die like branches on a vine.
Okay,
And so that's sort
okay.
of that's, I guess, I'm not speaking like as if, oh, I was in the writer's room when it happened, but that's sort of the logic that at least makes sense, and it
That
does, like,
seems
I
that
mean,
seems
it
to
seems to correspond to just how reality in general works, right? I mean, even just using the analogy of branches on a vine, well, I mean, that's obviously a very kind of Christocentric and just a very logical kind of way of thinking about it.
well, it's interesting because alright, so they introduced this temporal loom, MacGuffin in season
Mhm.
2, and the temporal loom seems to be this fancy sci-fi device that takes all the different timelines because, it's not that there's only one timeline does not mean only one multiversal reality, right? Like, only one universe. There's still a multiverse,
Mhm.
but any of the multiverse that creates that don't apply to the sacred timeline, that create, like, basically alternate versions of, He Who Remains, who create villainous kings, those
Mhm.
timelines, those universes are what get pruned, right? Because, like, there's different Lokis, there's all kinds of different Lokis, it's and I don't think that this this show says there's not a multiverse, it's just saying that there is a multiverse, but only some timelines are allowed to exist, right?
Well, and this
Um,
kinda gets into the whole, and I know we've joked before about how I always roll my eyes about, like, multiverse stories because of it's it's because this is what it sort of becomes, you're kinda saying how it's like, well, if this one gets destroyed, then, like, they all, or if this one doesn't matter, then none of them matter, and that's sort of the danger of any sort of multiverse whenever you kinda propose that as an idea, especially when you talk about an infinite multiverse, which oftentimes people use the word infinite, in a very sloppy way. But
yeah,
when you start talking about, I mean, for one, it almost becomes a self contradiction, because if it's infinite, then it can't be like this, like a physical thing. Like if it is a physical thing, then it literally can be limited or counted. But anyway,
yeah,
I know. Like I said, we use the term infinite in a very sloppy way where we just try to make it mean a lot, which is, I
mhm.
guess, fine. I mean, I don't like it, but it's fine. Um, but it does, like, it basically undercuts reality itself unless you have this, well, now this is the sacred timeline, or this is the prime world, or the prime universe on which the other ones derive, which
Mhm,
again, we operate whenever we watch a TV show, let's just say like Loki in this case, we're always under the assumption that, like, the one we're watching, unless we are told otherwise, is the prime one, right? And so when we say there's all these other Lokis, we always describe them in terms of how they're different from our quote unquote original Loki. So we'd say, like, oh, instead of a human, it's an alligator, or instead of a, young debonair British guy like Tom Hiddleston, it's an old guy like, I can't remember, but you know what I'm
yeah,
talking
the
about. Or
classic Loki,
or instead of wearing his,
or
Asgard, uh, costume, he's wearing a suit because he's like a politician, I guess, or whatever. So it's like,
yeah,
but we
yeah,
always describe them as derivative from what we considered, at least up until we were told otherwise, our, sacred
Prime,
Loki or our
Loki
prime Loki.
Prime, yeah.
And but there again, it doesn't, even if whether we were right or wrong, the whole point is that we always have to start with that, because without a prime, quote unquote, prime version or a sacred timeline, that does have to be the one on which all the other strands are, derived. And so, and that's the thing, is that the other ones then all become less meaningful compared to the prime one, because that's what they're all based off of. And so you can't have this like literally infinite number of multiverses, or you can't even have like all the multiverses be equal in every way, because they all have to be,
They all
based off of
derive.
this. Yeah. Like,
Well, it's interesting. I and Marvel actually has a tongue-in-cheek nod to this within their like comic universe, and it seems
mhm,
to be because it's referenced. They do an Easter egg reference to it in season 2 of Loki, where
uh-huh.
their primary universe is Earth 616. So
Yeah.
it's not the first one, it's not the 2 millionth one, it's the 616th variant universe, right? And
Mhm.
that's the one that all the stories take place in and things like that, right? Unless otherwise noted. And at the end, the final episode of season 2, um, because the basic premise of how season 2 starts is that, well, we've killed he who remains. There will be a quote unquote infinite multiversal opportunity. Free will not be circumspect and or circumscribed, or whatever word I want to use there. And what we have to do is make sure that the multiversal war doesn't come about. So we have to keep an eye on all these different versions of King the Conqueror, he who remains, and make sure they don't get too big for their britches. And
Mhm.
there's and so that's the underlying premise of where the TVA wants to go, right? Like, what happens to the TVA now? Well, we become a police force not for the sacred timeline. We become a police force for all timelines, and our primary
Oh
objective
gosh.
is do not, yeah, right.
I was gonna
Okay.
say, what's the
Um,
political metaphor going here? What's the, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
yeah. Um, but our primary underlying objective will be to ensure this multiversal war like does not happen the way that he who remains prophesied it would happen, right? So
yep.
that's where that's what TVA wants to do now. And at the end of it, after the primary problem has been resolved in season 2, there's this offhand reference by Mobius, played by Owen Wilson. He's saying, B-15 is like any word on any of the Kang variants, and he's like, there was a little tiff on 616, but they took care
Mm,
of it. That's a reference to Quantum Mania. That's what he's
yep.
referencing there. In other words, one of these Kangs was trying to get too big for his britches, but they took care of it. And
Mhm.
so now the TVA is always going to be there to make sure that Kang doesn't get too big for his britches. I don't know. Maybe that's how a lot of the threads that they planned on having Kang the Conqueror be like the big Thanos level bad
Yeah.
for the multiversal saga or whatever they're calling it. Maybe that's how the TVA just becomes this Deus Ex Machina, and he becomes like a non-threat or something like that. Maybe that's how they're going to write his story out.
Yeah, because that's
Um,
one of the other things that I know everybody's been talking about too, is that they have to find a way to write Jonathan Majors out of the story, basically, because of the legal issues and stuff that he's been,
yeah.
yeah,
Um,
causing, we'll say, not just experiencing, but causing. So,
well, all right. So I want to jump back to briefly trying to recap season 2, because we got
yeah.
to temporal loom. And then you gave me a good kind of metaphor for it, how if the
Mhm.
sacred timeline dies, then all the other ones die. And so it's like,
I mean,
okay,
how it
I
sort
can
of works. Like, this is where, like, yeah, like logically, this is why you need to have it in the story or whatever, as to
mhm.
kind of the driving
And
force.
the temporal loom is designed to um all right. So initially it's created by He Who Remains in order to um create this problem if he gets killed, basically. This is like kind of the
Mm,
revelation at the end of the season 2, where all right, so in season 2 all the timelines are dying, the temporal loom is overloading, and it's going to blow up the TVA. And if the TVA gets blown up, then there's going to be no one there to take care of the timelines and things like that. And
mhm.
so they're trying to fix the temporal loom the entire series. That's the main gist. And they They have to go get a variant version of Kang to help them, recreate it. There's a new character, Ouroboros, OB, the snake who eats his tail, Ouroboros,
Yep.
right? For anyone who doesn't get that reference, um, he's a technician that's tech savvy, and he offers them all the explanations, and ultimately they end back up at He Who Remains chamber, though, from the end of season one, because Loki can't figure out a way to keep the temporal loom from blowing up. And it basically comes down to either he stops Sylvie from killing He Who Remains, or the temporal loom blows up and everything goes away, presumably,
Yeah.
right? And that's when He Who Remains kind of pauses time, and then Loki, he can pause time now too. And he's like, yeah, I knew this was going to happen. The temporal loom is there because you need me. Without me, the temporal loom blows up. And so I wasn't just going to like let you guys kill me like I pretended I was going to do at the end of season one.
Mm.
I always knew that you would have to come back and save her,
Yeah.
save me
It's the
from being killed
classic
by
bad
her.
guy, "You'll be back." I knew, yeah,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I always knew this day
Yeah,
would come.
yeah, exactly. It's like, so, and okay, what Loki does is, instead of, because Sylvie, she won't stop, right? You have to kill
Mm.
me. I'll never stop. You have to kill me, kind of thing. And Loki, instead of um killing Sylvie, he takes a outside the box thinking approach, and he says, I will replace the temporal loom with myself, and I
Hmm.
will become the new temporal loom, um, and
God
become
himself will
the
provide the
the guy.
sacrifice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, exactly, yeah, no, from a Christian
It's
perspective, this goes a very interesting place. I
yeah.
don't understand. I mean, I think the answer is magic. So basically, I mean, just like to play this out, he goes like, normally you couldn't use magic in the TVA, but they turn off like the dampeners, quote unquote, that prevent magic from happening in the TVA. And
Mhm.
again, the TVA is this like eternal place, this place outside of time. It's not really explained what the logic is there, but rules don't apply. And magic, it turns out that magic does work in the TVA. It's just that they have technology that prevents magic from happening, I guess. And so at some point they had to turn those dampeners off for other reasons, but now the Lokis can use magic. And so he's like, I'm just going to like go out to the temporal loom, and I'll blow it up with magic, and then I will grab all the different timelines, because they're tendrils, they're strands, they're strings, and
Mhm.
I'm gonna grab these infinite strands.
Like, he
We just
becomes the
won't think too
loom,
much about
sort of,
that.
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, but like he takes all of reality onto himself, and ascends to a throne, and becomes the omniscient character who keeps the temporal loom, like keeps the timelines alive via his own person. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not even trying to sound like a Christian. Like, like
Yeah.
I'm not
No,
even
I
trying to
mean,
make this sound theological. Like, I'm pretty sure that's what happens
no, that's
in this
100, and
TV
I
show.
think, and he takes, like, the title, isn't there, like, the title, like, God
And he
of
does it via
Stories or
magic, right?
something?
Like, that's how he's capable of doing
I mean,
this, is
that's,
like
yeah, like, that's the only
magic.
language
Like, he's
that
just
is made possible in this sort of world, is you just say magic, sort of. So, like, in a sense, and I
okay.
know we kinda had this conversation where it's
I'm just
like,
making sure I understood it,
yeah,
right? Like,
well, it kinda reminds me of our old conversation that we've had, I guess, over several months ago now, where it's like, if you scratch science hard enough, you get to magic, and if you scratch magic hard enough, you get to science, or whatever. But it's sort of like they
oh yeah,
all
for
have
sure.
this underlying foundation of, again, to use explicitly Christian language, I mean, it is sort of just supposed to be a grace thing. Like, that would be the language that a Christian would use when you say, how do all of these events work together for a greater purpose, right? Or you could even call it a glorious purpose, to use the title of the last
Mhm,
episode and the catchphrase of
mhm,
Loki
yeah,
going,
sure.
to
His
use the
glorious
catchphrase of the
purpose. I mean,
yeah. it's like you're like you said, it's theological language, and so why not just lean into it and say, like, this is what a Christian would call grace when they say that all things are working out according to for the good, according to those who or for those who love God. It's like this is Romans 8:28, but dramatized in a sense,
Well,
colorized, dramatized.
and I will point it out. I will point it out. So he ascends the throne, right?
Mhm.
It's just the throne that he who remains had at the end of time, Alpha and Omega stuff here. But
Yeah.
and he walks up and he has the strands in his hands, and when he sits with his hands outstretched.
Oh, yeah,
And
like
there's obviously
cruciform.
some, like, cruciform symbolism going on there, and then he pulls his arms together, and
Mhm.
all the strands become, like, I guess, one with him, or however you wanna phrase that. But, I mean, it's shockingly Christ-like, um, imagery where
Yeah.
and everything that the New Testament talks about Christ being all and in all, and all things are for him and by him, and you know everything, all that language, right? Like, that Loki becomes that, and he does it by sacrifice, by self-sacrifice. He's not dead, but then again, neither is
Yeah.
Christ, right? Like, and if you just if time itself, these timelines are basically reality, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
that's what they've been I mean, that's what we're supposed to consider it the entire time, like, in a sense, Earth 616 is one of those little strands that he pulled in and tied together.
mhm, yeah. And that make like TVA, it's funny because, like, the TVA is reality too, but it's outside of reality, right? And so again, it really is this, like, eternity, this place of eternity. The TV show
Mhm.
does nothing to explain this or differentiate it. It makes, like, passing references to time not working the same way and things like that. But it basically just, like, winks away any type of, like, deeper philosophical question as to, like, exactly what, where, how the TVA is. And that's honestly, from a Christian perspective, yeah, that's how the so do we. You know what I mean? Like,
Well,
because, like, the nature of eternity, we
and
just
unless
we
you
just
want
admit you
the
can't.
whole season to be one long conversation, like, one long
Mhm.
philosophical conversation, which, I mean, some of us might want, but some of us, I might even get a little bored with that. So
Mhm.
it's like
Yeah, exactly,
it's
yeah.
almost like if people wanna have a hour-long conversation on eternity, they'll listen to some podcast about it. But it literally is, and I'm using the word literally on purpose, like, the the tying together of all of reality, all of it's the Lord of History, which there's actually there's a book called The Lord of History by he was a cardinal, Jean Danelou, who was a
Mhm.
expert theologian on the church fathers and church historian and things like that. And he obviously doesn't just mean, hey, this is like a church history textbook. He's saying, like, this is what it means to be able to incorporate all aspects, all cultures, all time into this one big, you could call it prime narrative or sacred timeline. I mean, obviously, Jean Danelou doesn't use sacred timeline, but that's essentially what we're seeing played out. Is I mean, it's
Can I ask
absolutely,
you?
yeah, Christocentric.
Oh, it is, yeah, yeah. Here's your token encapsulation of, Christ Savior complex stuff for this year, kids. Like,
Mhm.
watch Loki season 2. But, do you think I think that the TV show fudges on this. Of course, I haven't, like, really. I gotta rewatch it, and, we'll see what I think. But, like, it seems like the only difference between He Who Remains and Loki at the end, He Who Remains at the end of season 1 and Loki at the end of season 2, is that, He Who Remains is, like, a bad guy and Loki is a good guy, right? Are
Well,
they not
but you get
there? Are they Well, I guess one allows for infinite timelines, and the other one, uh
and like you at least get the sense whether this is entirely fair or not, but like one is doing it as sort of like an
oh,
exertion of his
hubristically?
power.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas Loki is doing it as a sacrifice, right? I mean, we get the very real sense that he's making a sacrifice by doing this, right? He's not going to live life like he had been living anymore. He doesn't get to experience, what he was calling his life in the way that he was, prior to this,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
you get that sense that this is gonna be a sort of death for Loki, even if you just wanna call it a death of the ego. But the fact that he kinda goes back to you go back to, like, the first room, like, all the way back in episode 1 when he sees kind of his quote unquote "life flash before his eyes," and that he kind of experiences that again, but now after all the change that has taken place from the beginning of season 1 to the end of season 2. So it's like
Mm.
he's seen that same life flash before, but now he's, become so much wiser and so much better. And so
Well, there's an
it's not
interesting.
a purifying thing. Now it's almost like a beatitude. It is supposed to be
Oh,
a sort of beatific
yeah,
vision.
it is. It's alright, so, like, that reminds me of 2 things. The first thing I'll talk about is one of my favorite moments comes from the middle of season 2 where, Loki and Sylvie are having a conversation in the pie room. There's a room where everyone goes to eat pie. Okay, watch the
Yeah, I
TV
kind of
show.
remember that.
But in it, Loki is having the same conversation with Sylvie that they had at the end of season 1, where it's like, you know, she's like, the TVA does nothing but good. You need to just let people have free will and walk away. And Loki's like, if you give people free will, you need to be able to help them use it well. You need to be able to help them do it well, kind of thing.
Mm,
And she's like, it sounds like you're just trying to play God. And then his final line is, "We are gods," is what he
mm,
says, and he's making a reference to their like Nordic pantheon heritage, right? But from my perspective, I think that is a good jumping off point for the biggest question of this TV series. I think is the fate versus free will question.
yeah,
Um, and it seems like Sylvie defines free will as uncompromised, unencumbered ability to will what you want,
as
right?
license, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, as like license to do what you want.
Mm,
And I think that's a very modern interpretation of free will, whereas I think a
yeah.
classical interpretation of free will never ever precluded the obvious limitations on free will as such. As in, you're not free to go fly out the window because you're not a bird. You are a human, right?
Well,
You're not
and not even
free.
just
Yeah,
oh,
go
go
on.
ahead.
No,
So
you go.
it would go back to this idea of, and actually it goes back to our idea of telos, which I know the episode on telos hasn't aired yet, but the whole idea is that even something as abstract as freedom is ordered towards a final cause or towards an end. And it's not just about the physical limitations, like I am not free to fly because I don't have wings, or I don't have, the energy from the yellow sun that allows me to.
Hmm.
It's it also restricts, so to speak. And again, restricted is not the best word for it, because in a sense, if freedom itself is ordered towards the good, like goodness itself exists, and freedom is an abstract idea or concept that we get to kind of play out through our actions. But if it is ordered towards the good, then if my choice isn't ordered towards the good, I'm actually less free. It's not even so much that that goodness is restricting my freedom. It's that when I don't act towards the good, I have restricted
Yeah.
like, I'm less free,
Yeah,
right?
it's a definition for freedom that is not license. It's a definition for
Mm,
freedom, which is like the ability to act, right? Like and primarily the ability to act how you're supposed to. This is
yeah.
actually, we'll tie this into the American Revolution episode a little bit. One of the
Alright.
biggest things that, the American founding fathers were all about when they talked about liberty, and they talked about freedom, if you go into the essays and the documents and the Enlightenment thinkers that they were reading, and that informed those, justifications and opinions that they used, when deciding to begin the American Revolution, things like that, the reason why they were so antithetical to tyranny as such is that tyranny removes your ability to be virtuous. In
Yeah,
other words, if I am forced to do the right thing, then it's not me doing it. It's me being compelled to do it. I can't be good unless I am free to be good. And if
It's
a
almost
tyrant
like,
is going to make me do it, then he's removing my ability to actually grow in virtue.
yeah, the evil of coercion is worse than the evil of you not doing the good thing that you should be doing. So,
Mhm.
like, even if a good thing happens because I forced you to do it, a greater evil occurred because I forced you. And so
Mhm.
that's where, and again, not that we're trying to become utilitarians where we're like quantifying good versus bad. It's more, it kind of goes back to the sacred timeline thing where it's like, as good as one of these branches is, it can't be metaphysically better than the original one, because the original one is the cause for the branch. In the same way that if there's a deeper good, that in freedom itself being ordered towards the good is deeper than you doing some good thing, some derivative good thing, then it can't be greater than the source, right? Or the cause can't be greater than, or sorry, the effect can't be greater than the cause.
Mm.
um
Sure.
and so that, like I said, that's a metaphysical reality that applies not just to, when we're talking chemistry. It applies to even human actions in this case.
Well, and so to bring it back, so Sylvie, she seems to want a kind of freedom that that implies the ability to act as I see fit, regardless of consequence, right?
Mm,
And Loki seems to come around by the end of season one, and then the TVA as such seems to exist in order to continue to facilitate freedom circumscribed by greater purpose, right? Like existence in this case. The ability for life to exist as such seems
mm,
to be the foundational role for the TVA to play, even if that was originally created by a kind of megalomaniac person who was using it to serve his own existence, right?
mm,
The fundamental premise of it being there to preserve existence as such still seems to be a role for the TVA to play. I still feel a little wishy washy as to how I exactly understand, like how the show justifies this. You gave me a
mm.
lot with the whole like the sacred timeline needs to stay alive so the branches live off it and things like that. But I guess that implies that once the sacred timeline has been established by the temporal loom, you can't undo it because in theory all these multiverses existed before He Who Remains created the temporal loom. Or maybe it's a paradox. Maybe it's just like a weird timey-wimey thing, like
Yeah,
I don't know. I
that'd be
choose to not
something
even like
that,
think too much about it, but anyway, I like
yeah.
your analogy. I'm gonna stick to it. I'm gonna stick to it like glue. The idea that the
All
sacred
right.
timeline has to exist, and that's why everything else will fall apart without it. But I lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was going. Or the
Well,
TVA is preserving the sacred timeline. Oh, because the TVA serves a circumscribed sense of freedom. It's not
and
they're
I
against
think,
free will, but
yeah.
but they understand that free will like it's freedom to serve what's good. It's and good in this case happens to
Well,
be
and no, like you were saying, if they are, if nothing else, they are protecting the sacred timeline because that's what allows for everything else to exist, then that we're actually kind of getting into metaphysical goods again, because then you're talking about being itself and how existence in and of itself is better than non-existence. And so if the whole point of the TVA is to preserve the sacred timeline, then they're trying to uphold existence, right? So they kind of have like this, I guess, I mean, if they never use the TVA again in any other Marvel thing, then it probably would be fine anyway. But if their whole purpose is to uphold, along with, if Loki's the one that kind of holding it together, so to speak, but they're upholding it however you want to, define that or make it work is fine. But then, like you said, they're outside of time, they're outside of, like, they're in eternity. That's what they're preserving, the existence of all the other things. And so that
mhm,
would be good, so to speak, right? And like I said, metaphysically good, which is where moral goodness comes from. But the other thing too that, and I don't know how much this adds to the sort of like wrapping of the bow or the Loki thing, but if he was like replacing the loom, the temporal loom, with himself. Like he becomes the temporal loom, so to speak, right? Because he's the one
yeah,
keeping it all together. And what do we
yep,
see happens after he does that? is that all the timelines become this tree, right? They become this new tree
Mhm.
of life. So again,
Yeah,
very
isn't that nice?
Christocentric, very
Mhm.
theological language. Obviously, it
Yes.
has to play with it plays with the whole
Crazy.
Yggdrasil,
Yeah,
Norse
for sure. It's
mythology tree thing.
definitely a play on the Norse mythology, but the Norse mythology was always obviously,
Yeah, it's
easily implicative
and to the
of
degree that
the
it
tree of life,
reflects reality,
Christology.
it's Christian anyway, and you and I
Yeah.
aren't shy about saying that, so we're fine with that too.
Yeah, right.
So what even if it's on accident, we're going to say it reflects Christianity. But anyway, the other thing that I think is worth noting about that is we use language of manufacturing, of artifice, like a loom, right? That was a piece of technology that we
Mhm,
created, but we go from a loom to a tree. So we go from the manufactured to the organic. And what are the implications of that? I think it's just, if nothing else, it's a powerful kind of like symbolic change that the TVA was quote unquote created by he who remains. And now that has been, and the loom in a sense was created either by the TVA or indirectly by he who remains. And so you have this very kind of manufactured upholding of existence. And that's
mhm.
where you kind of get into the whole restricting of freedom, fate sort of thing. Because then,
Well,
and I
and
think I even referred to him as the puppet master, like the guy pulling the strings, right? I
it's not a
think I called him that at the
coincidence
beginning.
the TVA is intentionally bureaucratic. It
Yeah,
basically looks like
that was
it's
one of the
it's
jokes.
basically
Yeah,
a DMV in the sky, right?
yeah.
Like, that is how it's depicted, um, which is implicitly critical of the organization, but at the same time, the organization seems to have, uh, found a virtuous purpose, I guess, by
So
the end of season
you're
2.
gonna love the
Uh,
comparison that I make in just a second. But the fact that, like I said, if we're going from something artificial to something organic, that also kind of gives you a better understanding of the freedom that's being upheld here. Because now, if it's a more organic sense of like, it's not me, even when it's like I'm forcing you to be free, while I'm still forcing you, right? And
mhm,
so when you have this sort of like manufactured kind of step in the way that was put together by he who remains, it still sort of restricts or hinders the freedom. And I don't just mean hinders it in the sense of like it's not going towards the good, because that again, if I choose something, if I make an action that's not ordered towards the good, you didn't
mhm.
restrict my freedom. My action by its nature was not free, right? Or less free,
Well, I
right?
think this is oh,
But
so I
if
didn't
we
mean to finish, yeah.
if we go with the tree thing, if it turns into a tree, which again, Loki, by replacing the loom with himself, come in that sort of Christocentric like sacrifice, and it becomes this tree. Now every action that all those strands are tied together, it becomes organic. And so again, the free act by its nature, right? Think organic language, is ordered towards the good. And so that's what allows for it here. So here's my big metaphor that I was thinking of.
Okay.
You called it like the DMV in the sky, right?
Mhm.
And you referred to it as very bureaucratic and very like, a bunch of pencil pushers and all that stuff. And I was like, what if in this analogy,
Oh,
Loki
boy.
is like the Christ figure, then the
Okay.
TVA would be the church, because the church is the one
Ah.
cooperating with Christ, and it's the one where you see, like that's what you identify with the kind of I guess more
Honestly,
bureaucratic, like, but
that
it's
does
also
fit, doesn't
working
it?
with Loki to uphold the sacred timeline,
Any sense
right?
of hierarchy, especially like Protestants, especially the traditions I came out of,
Yeah.
anything that looks hierarchical looks like a DMV, right? Everything it's all
Yep.
bureaucracy and just standing between you and God and
You
red
know,
tape and all that
people
nonsense.
complained so much about Loki
Yeah.
being like, anti-Christian, and it's like Loki might be the most Christian TV show that's come out in the
It's
last
an
5 years.
extreme
This is
it's an
actually,
extremely,
and
yes, Christian-friendly TV show.
this was not in the outline, not in the script, but this is kind of unreal that what like, we're
It's
sort of
it's
like
just yeah.
processing this as it happens.
I do
So
think that, like,
it's
so in season 1, there's, like,
don't you
criticism of
remember
the
when Loki calls TVA his bride? Don't you remember that? No, yeah. Yeah. TVA, the
Um,
body of Loki, is that I think
yeah, exactly, right? Like, there's especially season 1, you get criticism of dogma, you get criticism of, um, the idea of, like, your freedom being prescribed, by some agency outside of you. both in both uses of the word,
Yeah.
um, that keep you from being able to like do whatever you want kind of stuff. There is a lot of like kind of like implicit criticism of like religion as such in season 1. I think that you could argue that, but
Mhm.
I don't think it's technically not criticism as it is just like an open question
Mhm.
in season 1 and continues to be well, I mean, frankly, it more or less gets resolved in favor of the TVA by season 2. It's like we
Yeah.
really do need an organization that kind of makes
Well,
everything work, and there really is a limit to freedom, and you really do need some godlike figure in the sky to hold it all together. And it's like, okay, well, golf clap
and the
writers,
fact that they
I
make him
guess you got there,
sacrificial, that they make him, yeah, it's
yeah.
like,
Well, because
and
if he's
what's funny
not,
too
then
is,
it does feel bad. Like,
yeah,
this
it
is why
feels gross,
Christianity
which is the
this is
sorry,
what
go ahead.
differentiates Christianity from all the other religions, is that our God suffers, our God, is self-sacrificial, our God is community. I mean, the one thing that, Loki doesn't have a good image of is the fact that, Loki is singular. So, what's kinda sacrificial in Loki's case is that he has to leave all his friends behind. The
Mm,
idea is that, like, the only thing he cares about anymore is his friends, and he's going to give them up and be alone forever, I guess. It's really pretty, like, sad and weird at the
yeah,
end. But, like, but he's gonna sacrifice being with the people he loves in order for them to live happily, right? Or live forever
to
instead
live
of
it out,
yeah.
to exist at all, to live
Yeah.
happily, and to live freely, right? Because that's the overarching theme of
That's
seasons 1
his
and 2.
that's the sacrifice. I would say within a Christian theological framework, the fact that we have a Trinity, that our God is Trinity in nature, looks differently than when it looks like with just
Mhm.
like Loki on his throne by himself forever
Yeah.
kind of thing. And I think that one of the differences is that in Christianity, um, everyone comes into eternity with God, right? Like, so there's this kind of division between just like the ontological nature of Loki's reality by the end of season 2
Mhm.
and the reality that everyone else has to lives in, right? Like there's this division between those two things. They're not the same thing and they're forever they'll be apart kind of stuff. I don't think that's what Christianity teaches, but that doesn't take away all the other symbolism that you see in this TV
Mhm.
show. Um
Well, nobody's
so
perfect. Yeah. And honestly,
I
though, the thing is that if the whole idea is just trying to get an awareness of, because as we've mentioned, like it's obviously trying to kind of touch upon more the Christocentric aspect, and so it's going to focus on the one example, like Loki being more of a Christ figure. We don't really see Loki being a Holy Spirit figure or a Father, God the Father figure, and so that's where, like you said, it's sort of, it's not obviously a denial of the Trinity. It's more like a, well, this is just the aspect we're trying to emphasize, right?
yeah.
And or I won't even say they were trying to emphasize it. It's the aspect that is the most obvious or most easily recognizable, to
Isn't it? It's kind of funny. The only symbolism for a Trinitarian type of reality in this show are either the three Time Lords, which turned out to be fake,
mm,
or the big mural of Kang that's like hidden behind the wall kind of thing that gets revealed, and
yeah.
he's a three-headed person,
Well,
or at
and that
least maybe
actually
there's
is,
more, but there's three primary heads kind of front and center.
yeah,
It and you see that that's like a pagan thing, like, they're like the
yeah.
three-headed god is throughout cultures throughout the world kinda thing.
Mhm.
We'll have to talk about that sometime, but, it's very
We should just do a
reminiscent of
number
that.
3 episode, honestly. I think that would be kind
Yeah,
of interesting. Like, because you know how, like,
probably
they
should.
always do the movie trilogies and just, yeah, the symbolism
Mhm.
obviously behind it and stuff. That would, we'll add it to the list. We'll add it to the list. So,
Well, what'd you think of
I
it? I mean,
mean,
wrapping it up, I guess, what's,
yeah. So I did have some, I think it is funny how, and maybe this is like a millennial thing, because now all the writers of TV shows are like very referential, right? And
Mhm.
so you get in a lot of endings where people, it's almost like writers patting themselves on the back when they talk about the importance of stories or the just impact of stories, or and Loki, taking the title God of Stories. And
Uh-huh.
and it did remind me of, again, I already mentioned Game of Thrones once, but I'm going to do it again. Do you remember at the end of the where they do it's like they're patting themselves on the back, like the writers of the show were talking about how important stories are. And it's like, you guys, know how you sound, right? And it's the same. And so I think it's just one of those where it's like we can't escape as, postmodern millennials, the self-referential kind of aspect of our artwork,
I
whether
have
it's whether it's like meme culture, or whether it's, I don't know. So that was something that I thought was funny, and I noticed
mhm.
that it happened in this show too, because they do lean right
I'm a
into it.
little less cynical on that than you, I think, because
Oh, I
I
think it's funny. I don't hate it.
yeah. Well,
I
I
mean,
mean, I'm not even sure I think of it as a kind of like self-indulgent thing. I
okay,
suppose I mean it technically is, right? Because you can't write a story about the importance of stories without there being kind of like a meta
yeah,
elements going on there kind of thing.
uh,
But that's stories are important. I'm a big believer in stories. A significant
yeah,
amount of my life is about the ingestion and thinking of stories and things like that. And so it's like I guess maybe I'll just say I'll give it to him. It's like,
yeah. I mean, no, it's
this really is a
look.
big deal.
I love
Um,
Joseph Campbell too. So whenever Rick and Morty includes like just, I don't think you've seen this yet, but there is a really funny Rick and Morty episode where they actually bring Joseph Campbell as a character in, because
oh,
Dan
that's
Harmon, the
funny.
creator,
Uh-huh.
you got to watch it. It's good. But because Dan Harmon, who has spoken that he's been very influenced by Joseph Campbell, similar to George Lucas, we've talked about in the past, and Hero's Journey and all that stuff. Um, one of his characters is called the Story Lord. Okay, now he's a
Okay.
villain, but it's like I
I
said,
like how all
it's
these characters just have the same name, like
yeah.
the
Well, it's like
god of stories, the story lord, the
that's
lord of
the other
history.
ironic thing, is
These
that
are
these are
all
professional writers who it's
yeah.
like, and yeah, what it has to be. So that was the other thing that, no, I honestly, I mean, I might roll my eyes about it, but I do kind of like it too. Like I think it's kind of
Mhm.
funny, and like you said, I of course I recognize the importance of stories and the impact and all that stuff. It's just funny when you see it kind of reflected back to you so obviously or so clearly.
But
The other thing I had to mention. Oh, go ahead.
no, I'll just briefly say this. I happened to watch the Guardians of the Galaxy Christmas special last night. Have you seen
Oh,
that?
okay. I have, yeah.
Um,
It's cute. I
they
don't know.
it is, it's cute. They have a ton of, like, jokes about how crappy actors are, how, like,
Yeah.
actors are terrible people. So, it's,
Yeah.
like, basically the inverse of what you're talking about right here.
Mhm.
It's just this conversation makes me think of that. It's a pretty
Yeah,
cute,
no,
funny show.
one of my favorite, so Eugene Cordero is the guy who plays Casey, or K5E,
Yeah.
and, he's one of, I mean, he's just so funny, and he steals a lot of scenes. Like, I don't know if he was meant to be as big of a character, but he's a really funny character in Loki, but he's in, he plays really small roles in a bunch of other shows. So, like, have you ever seen The Good Place? He's Jason's
I've
friend, Pillboy.
only seen a few episodes of it.
Yeah, then you may not have come across him because he played a small role in that one. But that's a Michael Schur comedy, and Michael Schur he was the guy behind The Office, behind Parks and Rec, behind The Good Place, and Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Oh, wow.
And Eugene Cordero is the only actor who's appeared in all of those TV shows. And so, like, in the Michael Schur verse, he's like somebody who keeps popping up. But and yeah, like
Does
I
that
said,
mean
he's
that all
just,
those shows are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
well, see, I
Is
don't
that
know
what
if
that
Michael Schur
implies?
did Loki though. So that's the thing, is there,
Oh,
it's just one of the strands where, yeah. Um
mhm,
where all these, because he's like a drug dealer in The Good Place, but then he's like a warehouse worker in The Office, I think, and he's a
sure.
I can't
I'm
remember what he
going
is
to
in Brooklyn
choose to
Nine-Nine.
believe that. I'm going to choose that they're
Yeah.
all variants of K5E.
Yeah.
Um, now that I know it, I can't unthink it. So,
Yep. Can't unsee that.
yeah,
So anyway,
perfect.
I wanted to include, that's another kind of favorite, like, I just top moment of mine from season 2, because anything he's
Uh-huh.
in, I'll give it a chance because he's pretty funny. So, but
Uh,
anyway,
yeah,
I don't
no,
know.
the
Anything else
things that I'll
to?
say, yeah, the one of the things I like most about this show is this conversation about free will versus fate and
Mm,
getting into the logic of free will. And I think it's an important I don't think the show does a good job really like wrapping it up in a bow, actually. Doesn't delineate it well enough as what I would like for it to say, which is to say that free will doesn't mean absolute freedom. And no one
mm,
ever thought it did. No thinking person ever thought it
Mm,
did, because we have all kinds of limitations on our freedom. And within
yeah.
Christianity, there's only one truly free being, and that's God. God
Mhm,
alone has absolute freedom, in the same way that God alone has absolute goodness and absolute all the other attributes of God,
mm.
things like that.
We
Um,
participate. We're participants
yeah,
in
we
God's
can
freedom, God's
participate
goodness.
in
Yeah.
his freedom, right? But that is not license, and it's not the ability. That's just not what freedom means. And if we can have more conversations about freedom not being, I'm free to be whatever I want, I'm free to be whoever I want, I'm free to pursue whatever I want, then I approve that message.
So I was gonna say, because obviously it's way too late to start getting into the whole existentialist movement and self-actualization and John Paul Sartre, but that's sort of what you're like. That's a relatively recent phenomenon of this self-actualization, which,
Mhm.
as you've mentioned, is very problematic to just the way that we think and the way that we act. And so, I like all things, it'll eventually circle back around to Aristotle and then to Aquinas, and the whole world will be okay again. That's it's a canon event that we come back
Yeah.
to Aristotle.
Yes, it's a canon
so
event, yeah. It's a
so
canon
it's
conversation.
see, Aristotle is on the sacred timeline, so everything is gonna have to. And then when Loki tied them all together, it was,
Yeah,
it'll all come back. It's fine. So,
sure. Alright,
but
man.
anyway, with that, thank you guys for coming to listen to this. Honestly, it was a fun conversation. Not what I expected when we first started kind of planning this and putting this together. Um, Hopefully it ties in with our season 1 conversation that was so long ago, but just kind of
Just last week,
enjoyed.
Mike, just last
Yeah,
week.
oh, that's right. That
Because
exactly.
time is weird like that,
Yep. That's another.
feels like 1,000 years ago to us, but it was
It
really
was
just a
that
couple
was just
days
another
ago.
strand that Loki tied together. So yeah, we
Mhm.
thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Jacob. And yeah, look forward to, who knows when we'll get to talk again, right? It could be ages.
You never know, man. See you next year.
Yeah. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.